Conspiracy and crime thrillers go hand in hand quite nicely together. There is a considerable amount of mystery and danger surrounding these stories that can leave the audience captivated with each passing moment. With a massive market, however, many stories can end up becoming generic and cliché. It takes a certain quality for it to stand out. Jonathan Ames took on that challenge when he created You Were Never Really Here, a self-contained book that focused on one central character. At around 100 pages, You Were Never Really Here keeps the reader engaged from start to finish. With an intriguing hook, the story builds to a much larger and complex matter that does not draw out the plot any longer than it must. Therefore, it is no surprise to see that a film adaptation would follow. Under Amazon Studios, Lynn Ramsey directed the movie version of You Were Never Really Here. It remained faithful to the spirit of the story, but changed some aspects of the novella to suit for a more movie-watching audience. Although the plots deviate from each other towards the conclusion, the film sought to expand the main character of the novella while creating a story with a more complete ending. The character of Joe is described in the book as a fairly large and strong man. It quotes him as 6'2", no fat. He was 48, but his olive-colored skin was still smooth, which made him appear younger than he was. He had a long, twisting Italian nose, with a thick forehead, another weapon, and his jaw was too big and long, like the blade of a shovel. Compare this to the 5'8" Joaquin Phoenix, who had to gain some weight in order to bring a more intimidating presence. To create the illusion of his burliness, his long, disheveled hair allowed his face to look bigger, while his beard gave the illusion of having a very large jaw. Along with the plain clothes and baseball cap, Joaquin Phoenix creates the look of the character despite not having the same build. Of course, looking like a character would be nothing without acting like a character, which Joaquin Phoenix does an excellent job. The movie portrayal of Joe is similar to the book, but with a few changes to his personality and attitude. In the novella, Joe delivers very little dialogue. He avoids small talk and has little personal connection with anyone. The film departs from this by expanding his relationships, particularly with his mother. The book describes their relationship as silent but loving. There is an unspoken bond between them as they communicate mostly through smiles and looks. Since the reader already understands the abuse they endured together, dialogue is not required to understand their loving connection. The film tries to relate the characters more towards the viewer. Scenes were added that highlight their lighthearted attitude and occasional bickering. It adds depth to their relationship and also creates emotional weight as the film progresses. Although these scenes show a different side to Joe that was never introduced in the book, it humanizes the character and allows the viewer to feel more connected to Joe instead of seeing him as a quiet, cold killer. The film further emphasizes this during the scene between Joe and his boss McCleary. In the original story, McCleary tries to strike up a friendly relationship with Joe using small talk. Joe clearly shows little interest, not because he feels disdain towards him, but it is his way of protecting the people around him. He keeps his sentences simple and strictly business related, avoiding any kind of personal conversation. This dynamic is completely altered in the film. Joe is in a relaxed state when meeting McCleary. He lays down on the office couch and eats jelly beans while talking business. The two chat with one another in a friendly manner. Like with his mother, the change in character relationship is to express Joe's inner feelings towards each character. This also helps build the foundation for when he finds a new companion with the character Nina. The book already explains that he cares for the people around him, but without a narrator, the film must rely on action and dialogue for the audience to understand him better. Thus, it does not follow the book in this way, but still captures the inner workings of the character. Besides changing minor aspects of the character, the film leaves out other details that were highlighted in the novella. Joe is very cautious and well prepared at his craft. He uses gloves to conceal his fingerprints and avoids leaving messages because he does not like the odds of his voice being recorded. He does this to protect the people around him, especially his mother, but the film decided that it was not essential to keep. The movie contradicts this characteristic by having 2 cases of Joe leaving a phone message. It is a minor detail that does not ruin the movie at all. In fact, the phone calls help the audience understand his business, and the lack of gloves may not be noticeable to viewers who have not read the book. This is an example of how books can add a layer of depth to a story because it can add details without hurting the production. Movies, on the other hand, have other factors such as budget, pacing, and being practical that affect the level of detail it can attain. This has the potential to upset some viewers who preferred a much colder, quiet Joe, but Lynn Ramsey wrote a character with the same past and issues but modified his personality, leading to better communicated relationships and method of executing his job. It would seem Joe has better control over his problems, but that does not mean that he is a mentally well individual. Trauma is what drives Joe forward through the narrative. As a boy, he was abused by his father constantly. On one such occasion, his father had used a hammer on him, knocking the young Joe unconscious. Interestingly, the hammer becomes Joe's signature weapon when on a mission. He uses the fear he faced as a way to strike back at his enemies, like Batman does with his phobia for bats. Trauma also shapes the way he feels. He tried to hide from his father's abuse, but when he was successful, his mother would have to suffer for it. This left him feeling guilty because his fearfulness caused someone he loved pain. He carried this burden with him as an adult, and it worsened as he experienced more terrible events as a Marine and FBI agent. One significant event mentioned in the book was when he found a truck full of dead Chinese women. They were gassed to death because their captors did not want them talking to police. Joe tells himself that if he had arrived 15 minutes earlier, the women would have been saved. It brings back the guilt he has been storing for years, causing him to go AWOL and getting kicked off the force. The film does not explain this, but instead relies on audio and visuals to clue the audience on Joe's situation. For instance, when a group of Chinese girls ask Joe to take their picture, their faces turn from smiling to crying. An eerie noise begins to resonate as the viewers enter Joe's mind. A sudden flash of dead women and a truck door opening take the screen. Readers of the book understand what is happening, but the film does not explain the guilt Joe feels on its own. To combat this, director Lynn Ramsey adds another flashback that was never mentioned in the novella. While serving as a Marine, Joe gives a little girl a candy bar behind a fence. As she walks away, an armed boy shoots and kills her for it, running away in haste. The scenario illustrates that Joe's kindness caused the little girl to die, presenting it in a way that the audience can understand the burden of living with that event. Paired with the dead Chinese women memory, the audience who have not read the book can understand the guilt he carries. It is because of this burden that Joe has this impulse to kill himself. He has come close to accomplishing it, but his love for his mother keeps him from finishing. Water plays a significant role throughout the story because it is Joe's escape from his life. While suffocating himself with a plastic bag, Joe figures that drowning himself and letting the current of the Hudson River take him to sea would be a less shameful way of dying. There would be no body to clean up or remember. It would be as if he were never really here. The film recreates this scene from the novella in the opening credits. The first shot takes place underwater. There's nothing but the green water and small specks floating around. The scene turns to black and opens to a close-up shot of Joe suffocating himself with a plastic bag. From the first few seconds, the film indirectly presents Joe's fantasy to drown himself when the time comes. The water plays another role because it cleanses the sins of letting his mother be beaten and not saving the Chinese women in time. This is reinforced in a shot from the film when Joe is drinking water from a fountain. The camera pans over a young girl, presumably the one he saved, onto the continuously running water fountain. Rescuing the girls allows him to be absolved from his sin like a baptism. It is only temporary, however, since after a moment, the water shuts off on its own and Joe is back to feeling alone and remorseful, setting the tone for the rest of the film. This is the point in the video where I'm going to be unveiling some plot differences, so I would highly recommend reading the book and watching the film before moving on. So this is your spoiler warning. With the main character defined, the film follows the plot of the novella for the first half. Most of these scenes follow through exactly how the book is outlined, other than having some extra dialogue scenes. The only change up to this point is the name of the missing girl. Her name was Lisa in the novella, but it was changed to Nina. In Spanish, it means girl, an intentional change to solidify Nina's purity and innocence being taken from her. This draws parallels to Joe, referring to his innocence being taken from him at such a young age. This becomes apparent when they cross paths. During the rescue, Joe makes his way through the building holding her, bludgeoning everyone in his path. He even takes out a patron with several blows to the head, which is pretty lucky considering that in the book, he ends up exploding his testicles with his steel-toe boot. Upon reaching her, Joe and the girl develop a soft relationship that was not at all covered in the book. She witnesses him killing her captors, which will ultimately make her succumb to the violence. There's not much dialogue between them, but the care Joe presents gives her a father figure because her own father is responsible for getting her in this situation. After a successful rescue, Joe takes Nina back to the drop-off. But plans change when he is met by dirty cops that whisk Nina away. Joe struggles with an armed cop, ultimately beating him, but is wounded from the gun's discharge. The book has him shot in the calf, limiting his mobility. He is forced to cut out the bullet and apply a tourniquet using duct tape. He takes several hours to have the hospital heal him, making it look like a home construction accident. The movie opted for a less drastic injury by having him lose a tooth after being shot. It allowed the story to progress without disrupting the pacing. One contradiction the movie makes with this is showing him ride the elevator. In the novella, Joe avoids elevators since they make him feel exposed. When going to McCleary's office at this point in the story, he is forced to use the elevator because his calf injury prevents him from using the stairs. A mouth wound, like the one he receives in the film, would not limit him using the stairs. It would not be the first time the film changes Joe's methods as mentioned before, but the film contradicts itself by acknowledging Joe's phobia for elevators in an earlier scene. This is probably the fairest criticism that book fans can give the film because it is such a minor detail that could have easily been avoided by taking out the scene entirely. It is probably the only instance where the adaptation is questionable, but something small as this does not really ruin the experience. Getting back to the plot, McClurry is found dead in his office, his blood spilling out on his desk. From McClurry's, Joe figures that the dirty cops found Angel's number, and since his son Moises knows where he lives, they had Joe's address. Using the fire escape, Joe makes his way to his mother's room to find that they had already gotten to her. Moises and Angel's body were also there in the book, but the movie makes a good decision by having them killed and left at the store. After taking out the men responsible, Joe places his mother's body into the river and lets her sink to the bottom, giving her the funeral he assumed would be his. This is where the story diverges in its conclusion. Both stories reveal that Nina's father, Senator Voto, was actually the one that sold her into sex trafficking. The film has a more straightforward revelation, while the book is more complicated in its conspiracy, involving corruption with the mafia. The book concludes with a final confrontation between Joe and Voto, where all is revealed, including the location of Nina. Just as the story feels like more is to come, it ends, leaving the reader with only the back cover. Although we do not get to read about the demise of the real antagonist, we understand Joe's intentions from an earlier scene. The novella reads, "He'll kidnap the bastard, cut him to pieces over a few weeks, always stitching him back up, keeping him alive. He'll remove his fingers, toes, feet, hands, testicles, penis, tongue, nose." Knowing how skilled Joe is, it is very likely that he is going to succeed, so the author felt there was no need to prolong the story any longer. The film instead wanted a more conclusive ending that focused less on Joe's revenge and more about rescuing Nina. They tweaked the plot to serve this need, simplifying the conspiracy in the process. In the film, Senator Voto sells his daughter but then feels regret after having Joe rescue her. He commits suicide by jumping off a building. This death was reserved for another character in the novella, but the film-altered plot made Voto's death more convenient. Instead of facing the senator, Joe has his final confrontation with the real antagonist, but finds that he has already perished by Nina's hand. Joe's traumatic connection with Nina caused her to kill her captor. She was inspired by watching Joe kill the ones that had done her harm. The two leave the crime scene, unsure of where to go next. Both endings leave the audience to their own imagination, leaving it unclear whether Joe lives on or eventually killing himself. The main difference between these two stories is that the film ends on a much lighter note. The antagonists are destroyed and Joe has succeeded in saving Nina, leaving them alone but together. The novella ended with the main conflict unsolved. Joe and Nina's fate are uncertain like the movie, but the book leaves much more to be desired. In an interview with Lynn Ramsey, she says that the book did not feel finished to her, and it was her intention to end the story her own way. Jonathan Ames was supportive of her changes, as long as she kept the same kind of quality. Although the film is not completely faithful to the novella, it keeps the spirit of the story alive. Joaquin Phoenix not only captures the character of Joe, but also projects the human side of this darkly brewing killer. The intention of the book was to engross the reader in a thrilling tale of violence and mystery, but also to reveal a darker perspective to the human condition. The film keeps the same themes in place but adds a lighter attitude to it, concluding with a more hopeful outcome. In essence, the story sets out to focus on one character battling his way through his past and present. He is alone, exactly the way he would like to perish, to disappear from the rest of the world. Despite losing everything, he finds motivation to keep struggling through this terrible life thanks to one unfortunate girl whose fate is tied to his.